Next, measures of inflation. How exactly can we measure inflation? Yes, it's a percentage change in the price index, but what sort of price indexes can we use? There are two main indexes which are frequently used in microeconomics, in macroeconomic research, in newspaper articles, and so on. The first one is called CPI, Consumer Price Index, which measures how consumer prices have increased over a particular period of time. So how exactly it's calculated? Literally in thousands of different shops throughout the UK, prices of a variety of goods are measured or are checked on a regular basis, let's say once per month. There is a representative basket of goods which an average consumer is purchasing regularly. For example, an average consumer can buy 1 loaf of bread, 1 pint of milk, 1 kilo of chicken or something else, or maybe 5 liters of petrol, and so on. So a representative basket of goods is checked regularly. How much different prices for different products, for different goods have changed during this particular period, and the weighted average price is calculated. And changes in this consumer price index represent inflation in consumer prices. Apart from this, we can use another index which is called GDP deflator, which is calculated slightly differently. It will include not just consumer prices, but prices of all goods produced in the UK, both consumer and investment goods. However, it will include only domestically produced goods, while consumer price index will include both domestic goods and imported goods, because obviously as a consumer you will buy lots of imported products, and if prices of imports will go up, your costs of living will increase dramatically and standards of living will be affected. It matters a lot to you if imported products become more expensive. So consumer price index, let me even write it down. CPI, Consumer Price Index, will include both domestically produced goods and imported goods, but it will only include consumer goods only, while GDP deflator will only include domestic goods, but includes investment goods as well. That's the difference between these two measures of inflation. These are two most commonly used measures. Apart from this, there are some indexes which show inflation in different sectors of the economy. For example, wage inflation. This will show how quickly wages are growing in the economy. Or house price inflation. Again, it will show you how house prices are going up, and so on in different sectors of the economy. Strictly speaking, they tend to move quite closely with each other. When one measure of inflation goes up, usually other measures will follow. For example, this graph represents the data on various measures of inflation during the last 20 years approximately. For example, GDP deflator is shown in blue, while our CPI index is shown in green. And you can see here, when one falls, another one falls as well. When one goes up, another one will go up as well. However, weekly earnings or wage inflation will not exactly follow the same pattern. For example, you can see that in 2009, when the country experienced financial crisis, earnings dropped dramatically. They've dropped by 3%, while inflation was still positive. So prices of goods were still increasing, while people earned considerably lower wages. And in recent periods, in the last 5 years, wage inflation was higher by about 2%, while actual inflation in goods was considerably lower. In other words, real purchasing power of wages was higher. Wages were growing quicker than prices of consumer products. Another graph will show you differences in inflation rates in different countries. For example, red line shows our inflation in the UK, green line shows inflation in Europe, American inflation is shown in blue, and Japanese inflation is shown in this brownish brown color. And what you can see in this graph is that in the first half of the period, I would say, in the second half of 20th century, inflation was considerably higher, with huge spikes in inflation around 70s to 80s. For example, in the UK, inflation reached nearly 23% per year. This was huge inflation, and it was even higher in Japan. In recent years, in recent decades, inflation settled down, and central banks managed to bring it under control. For example, in the UK, the the current inflation target is around 2%. So this is what Bank of England is trying to achieve, to stay within 2% annual inflation. What you can also see from this graph is that Japan very frequently experiences deflation, in other words, fall in prices. The inflation rate is frequently below zero for the last 35 years approximately. In other words, in Japan, prices are not growing. Sometimes, in some years, they even go down, and sometimes by quite significant amount, by about 3% per year. So generally, Japan doesn't experience any inflation. Unfortunately, Japan doesn't experience economic growth as well. So generally, they are doing quite well in terms of achieving one macroeconomic objective, but they're suffering because they are not achieving another one. In the next video lesson, we'll talk about why inflation is a problem, and we'll talk about the costs of inflation.